Officially have a Democratic primary for governor. Joining the fray last week, former state senator Molly Kelly. She's our guest this morning on Close Up. Senator, thanks for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam.
So you get into the race and your opponent, Steve Marchand, we're interviewing him, and pretty much the first thing he says to this is this, quote, "We know that a small group of Concord insiders were over the last year looking for somebody that was trying to relitigate the 2016 presidential primary." Just to be clear, that Hillary versus Bernie reference was unprompted. We basically asked him, what are your thoughts about this race? What are your thoughts about those comments?
Adam, what I'm really focusing on is my campaign, and that's what I'm going to do. We have put a great campaign together, a strong campaign. I'm so excited to move forward, and the encouragement that I've received from many people in New Hampshire. And we are excited moving on. We're going to address the issues that I think are very important. You know that one of the reasons, the biggest reason I'm running for governor is because I am really concerned about the direction of the state, and I want to make some changes. And that's what our campaign is all about. This is a campaign for all the people of New Hampshire, and we are running a grassroots campaign that will be powered by the people of New Hampshire. And I'm looking so forward to that, and we're already started.
Clearly, there are some people who want to make this about a establishment versus outsider dynamic, which has been part of the Democratic Party for a long time now. What would you say to a Democratic voter who wants to know who the quote-unquote true progressive is in this race?
You know, Adam, I am talking with people every day, and I'm telling them my story. I'm telling the story of my life and what's important to me, what my values are. And I stand on my record of 10 years in the Senate, and I am proud of that record. I was one of the very first state senators to vote for marriage equality. I have stood by women and will continue to stand by women on any choice issues. I trust women, and I have been there for them from the very beginning. Other pieces of legislation that I'm proud of are a bill I put in about group net metering, which is really a progressive, at the time, very progressive about what we can move forward on solar energy. What I understand is there's a piece of legislation now in the Senate and the House to move that even further. And those are the kind of things I'm going to focus on. We are talking about opportunity. We are going to be talking about education and training. We know it's a big issue in the state. What I want for New Hampshire is I want a New Hampshire where all the people, not just a few of the people, have a chance to succeed.
Some people see a Democratic wave building in 2018. It's possible you could be governor. There could be a Democratic House, maybe even a Democratic Senate as well. If that blue wave legislature sends you a bill that includes an income tax, a sales tax, or any other broad-based tax, would you pledge to veto it?
Adam, I think the people of New Hampshire want a clear answer on this, and I will not support a sales or an income tax.
We've heard some progressives say that in 2008 you ran and said that all options should be on the table for education funding. Is that true? You've evolved on this issue?
When I was in the Senate, I represented a district, District 10, and I spoke for that district. I'm running for governor. I'm running for all the people of the state. And as governor, I would veto any sales or income tax.
When we did our first interview, you said that you would work with the Trump administration to advance the interests of New Hampshire. In any other context, in any other year, a pretty benign statement. We heard from some Democrats who were like, yikes, I didn't realize she'd be willing to work with President Trump. They're in this kind of resistance mode. Do you think you have a good read on just how angry the Democratic base is with President Trump?
You know, after the last election, so many people, and I'm with people every day, and including myself, are devastated, really disappointed, having a hard time to realize what had happened. And as I said to you earlier, there is, I can't think of one thing I would agree with Donald Trump. However, as a governor, if the Trump administration had passed some legislation or was able to provide some funding, in particular funding for the opioid crisis, as governor, why would I not accept that funding? We need to address the opioid crisis, and I am open to all solutions, and obviously we need a lot of funding to be able to address that issue.
You mentioned the opioid crisis. Clearly access, especially in rural areas of the state, is a problem that's been ongoing in terms of being able to find treatment. If somebody is addicted to fentanyl in the Monadnock region, where do they go to get treatment?
They go to, there are a variety of places that we can go, but this is really how I want to address the opioid crisis. Because I think, to your point, what we've been doing is looking at different areas. This, almost like throwing darts at different aspects of how we can actually address this issue, and we're not getting it done. We've been talking about this for a long time. I was one of the first senators who brought this issue to the state Senate. We are done talking about this epidemic. It is time to act. And I feel that the way that we can really act and to address this issue is to treat it as we would any other healthcare epidemic. If this was an epidemic that was taking lives, but was called something else, we would put an end to it, because we would treat it as a healthcare issue, and we would create a systemic system throughout New Hampshire, like we do for other epidemics in healthcare, and address this issue. That's how we have to do it. That's how I would do it as governor.
Education is another top issue for you. It's possible the legislature could pass SB 193, which essentially would provide public dollars to private schooling for students who want to take advantage of these education savings accounts. If elected, what would you do to that sort of system in process of being set up, particularly if there are families who are getting into it and counting on that for the next school year?
Look, Adam, what's important here is that we invest in education and we invest in training, because we know that there's a lack of workforce, and we have to address that. It doesn't make any sense, absolutely no sense today, ever, to take money from public education to pay for private and religious schools. That bill came about when I was in the Senate. It is national. It is not just about New Hampshire. I stood on the floor in the Senate and I spoke strongly against that bill. It is wrong for New Hampshire. It is wrong for education. And as governor, I would do whatever I could to veto that bill. What we need is, and we have an education system, public education, that is really the core of who we are and the core of democracy. We need to invest 100% and not take money from there. In that whole system of education, I think the important aspects are valuing our teachers and listening to them. I have listened to them. I've been in classrooms with teachers. They love what they do. It's a vocation for them. That's what they want to do. You know, you have young children, they go to school. We take our children to school. These are people who really love the children they're working with and their students, and they want them to succeed. They need our support. The school systems need our support. The last thing we need to do is to take money away from those teachers, from the school systems, and move it into public or into a private or religious schools.
So it's safe to say that if that system was in the process of being set up, you would encourage the legislature to dismantle it right away, and you would even take steps as governor to make sure that it didn't come into being.
Absolutely.
DCYF is another issue that's been sort of gone downhill between that 2010 to 2015, 2016 period. What would you do differently, or perhaps go farther than Governor Sununu in terms of these reforms, in terms of making sure that we don't see these unconscionable child abuse fatalities with DCYF involved children?
Everything I can. Everything I can. What if it's legislation, if it's looking at the programming and how we are addressing the issue, and making sure that there's enough staff that can address each one of those cases. This is New Hampshire. We can take care of these things. And especially our children that are in situations that are difficult. So, yes, absolutely.
Do you feel in any way as a senator, though, I mean, you were there during this time when DCYF was going downhill. Do you bear any responsibility for the consequences of what happened there, having been a leader in the state when this all unfolded?
I think that a lot of the issues have come forward that hadn't come forward at the time, and they need to be addressed, and I would be addressing them right away. There's no way as a governor I could go to bed at night thinking that there was a child that was being hurt or abused, and I will do something about it.
Governor Sununu is obviously the goal to get to for you after the September primary. In terms of a contrast, what is your leadership style? How does it differ, I guess, from what you see from him?
Well, I think I have a 10-year track record in the Senate of working together, working across lines to solve problems. Some of the things that I see as a real difference is when Chris Sununu was first governor, he actually passed a law to repeal the current law so that people who were carrying a concealed weapon would not have to have a permit. And the first thing I would do is to repeal that law back. That is just common sense safety. We live in small communities. People who carry a concealed weapon just need to receive a permit. And it's a kind of community where we can say, you know, maybe that's not such a good idea for this person. Or
safe to say firearms will be a defining issue, you think, in this election?
I think so. I think so. It is something for me that goes to the heart of, again, of our children. I am so proud of the young people who got up and have stood up. I mean, look at them, how they've stood up to say, enough. Enough is enough, and they want to be able to go to school and be safe. You know, a couple weeks ago when I was, as I mentioned, with my own granddaughter who is 17, and this is an important issue to her as well with all the young people, and we were at one of the marches in Portsmouth, and I had the opportunity to talk with people there, and I spoke with a teacher who had taught first grade all of her life, and she said to me, you know, this is the first time that I have had to be a first grade teacher and take my first graders into a corner during just a trial, just to prepare for something would happen. And I was trying to find out how I was going to explain to them why we were doing this so that they wouldn't be more frightened. Now, Adam, when I took my children to school, I didn't worry about that. I have grandchildren now. I worry about that. You're a parent. You worry about that. That's unacceptable. We are talking about common sense gun safety. That's what these young people are. They understand what is the effect that it causes death to young people, and we're not going to put up with that anymore. So the first thing that I would do, obviously, is to look at our what we can do to really pass common sense gun safety legislation, and I would instantly reinstate the law that says, yes, you do need a permit if you carry a concealed weapon.
All right, Senator Kelly, running for governor, we appreciate your time. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.